Typography is drawn using vectors, and that's why Illustrator is an important tool for working with type. You can access type in Illustrator by clicking on the Type tool. This can also be accessed by clicking T, and just click anywhere on the canvas. By default, the words lorem ipsum will appear. This is filler type, also sometimes called Greeking, and it's really just a placeholder for any other words that you might put in here. So it just gives you an understanding of what the type is going to look like. You can, of course, replace this with whatever you want. This is called point type, and whenever you just click, you create a point type object. If instead of just clicking, you took the type tool and clicked and dragged to create an area, you create what's called area type, and this works a little bit differently from point type. You can see, again, by default, it created a bunch of filler type to fill this in, but again, it works a little bit differently. So I'm going to click off of this to remove my cursor from the type area. Then I'm going to click V to bring up the selection tool. That's also the black arrow at the top of the toolbar. And I'll show you some of those differences. So if I highlight the point type, which is the one over on the left, and click one of the handles to resize it, you can see it's going to make the word bigger. That's because point type, the size of it is actually defined by the typography that's inside. Area type works the other way. The type shape is actually defined by the shape of the container. So if I go ahead and resize this to make it smaller, you can see it didn't actually change the size of the words. It just constrained the type to a smaller container. And it actually hid some of the words at the bottom. So a lot of the type that was formerly here is no longer visible. And that is bringing up this little red icon. That red icon is telling us that there is some hidden type, and not all the type in this box is being displayed. And so if I go ahead and make this longer, you can see the type is still there. It was just formerly hidden. And once I make this larger, that red icon disappears. I'm going to undo that and show you another way to handle this same type of situation. And that's by double-clicking on this little handle at the bottom. When you do that, it'll resize the type area to be exactly the size that it needs to be in order to display all the type. And if I select the point type sample and then rotate it by hovering on the outside of these handles, you can see that it rotates the actual word. Whereas with the area type, if I do the same thing, it only rotates the shape of the container. So all the words are still flat, they're just now trying to awkwardly fill this sort of rotated container shape. So I hope that gives you an understanding of the differences between point type and area type. Generally speaking, area type is what you're going to want to use if you have a lot of words. But if you're working on a single word for something like a logo, you're probably going to want to use point type. You can always convert point type to area type. If you select it and double click this little handle on the outside, that'll create area type out of this. So now you can see if I resize this container, the size of the typography stays the same. And if I make it a little smaller, it's going to rearrange the typography itself to fit into that container. So this is now area type. And same with the area type. If I double click this little handle on the outside, this will now become point type. So if I go ahead and rotate this, you'll see that this now acts as point type because it is indeed a point type object. One of the downsides to doing this, though, is that now all these line breaks are actually built in to the typography itself. So if I go back and try to change this to area type, I'm going to have an issue because if I make this bigger, you'd expect this typography to flow to fill the container. But it doesn't because we've now burned in all these little extra line breaks in here that are going to cause us some issues. So be careful when converting area type to point type because you might run into that issue. Again, generally speaking, if you have a lot of words, you're going to want to be working with area type anyways. So let's look at some of the different things that you can do with typography in Illustrator. And these functions and terms are actually universal. So you can do any of this stuff in all of the Adobe programs, and really any program that works with type is going to have similar functionality. So I have a point type object here, and the main functions to make adjustments to this are going to be through the character panel, which I have on this button in this vertical panel group. If you don't have the character panel, you can always add it by going up to Window and down to Type and adding it right here under the submenu for type. You can also access the character panel by going into the properties menu. So if I have type selected, the character panel will appear here in its abbreviated form. If I click this little ... it'll give me the rest of the character panel. It's also part of the control panel at the top. So you can tell that this is a really important part of the program. So this little thing that says character here, if I click that, again, I'll get the character panel again. And Adobe also provides me with some shortcuts. So this drop down will allow me to change the font. This will allow me to change the font weight. This will allow me to change the point size. Let's open up the full character panel to go through all these options. And if you don't have all the options in the character panel, click on this little hamburger menu and then either show or hide options. This toggles between these advanced functions that maybe aren't as useful as the core functions, but they're still good to have. This top selector allows me to change the font family. So all the different fonts on my computer are selectable through this dropdown. These fonts can be installed through your operating system. For now, I'll go ahead and choose Lemon Sans. And then underneath that, you have a drop down for all the different weights. So unlike Microsoft Word, where you just have bold, regular, and italic, a lot of fonts are going to have many weights. So in the case of Lemon Sans, I have everything from thin to bold, and then I also have italic and regular for each one of those weights. Go ahead and choose medium for now. This first adjustment will allow me to change the font size. So I can either select this and type in whatever I want. If I type in 60 and then hit tab to apply that, you'll see my font size will change. I can also hit this little down arrow to select a font from these presets. I can also use these up and down arrows to change the font one point at a time. Lastly, I can put my cursor inside of this text box and use the up and down key to change the font one point at a time. Also, if I hold down Shift and use the up and down key, I can change the point size by 10 at a time. So Adobe gives you a bunch of different options for how to change these settings, and those same options work for the rest of these as well. Next to the font size is the leading, and the leading changes the space between lines of type. So since right now I only have one line of type, it's not actually doing anything. But if I double click to put my cursor back into that type object, and then hit return and type in a second line, now the leading will actually change what's going on here. But in order to affect the leading, I actually have to first select everything first, and then I can change the leading. And the reason for this is that the character adjustment actually applies to just one individual character. So if I don't select everything first, the leading won't actually change. So for instance, if I put my cursor back to right after the Y and change the leading, well, it's not actually doing anything because I don't actually have a character selected. Another way I can apply the leading value to this type object is by going back to the selection tool and then just selecting that type object. And then by changing this value, it's going to change the leading of all the characters inside of that object. Underneath leading, you have the tracking value, which adjusts the space between characters. So if I increase this to 70, you'll see the characters are spaced much further apart. Whereas if I go down and actually start to go negative with it, they'll get really close together and eventually start to run into each other. So this is really good if you want to make some kind of aesthetic adjustment to your type, but you want to keep it within reason. You don't want it to get too extreme, otherwise it's going to affect readability. Next to the tracking, you have the kerning. And the kerning is somewhat similar to tracking in that it adjusts the space between characters, but these two things serve different functions. Tracking is if you want to increase or decrease the spacing of the letters overall in a word, whereas kerning is if you want to make a micro adjustment to a specific letter pair. So for instance, in this word, I think that the T and the Y are a little bit far apart. They don't feel as evenly spaced as the rest of the letters in the word typography. So if I double click to put my cursor in between those two letters, I can go ahead and put this more in the negative direction for the kerning value to bring them closer together. You can see by default, this letter pair has a kerning value of -30. So the person who created this font actually dialed in a little bit of adjustment for that particular letter pair. But I think it needs a little bit more. So I'm going to go ahead and just reduce that to -50 to bring those letters a little bit close together. Kerning is a great way of bringing refinement to your typesetting, particularly when you're setting a big headline or some kind of logo where you really want that letter spacing to feel even and just generally on point. I think in this case, I can bring the P and the O a little bit closer together as well, along with the O and the G. Those feel a little bit loose. The PH combination also feels a little bit loose as well, as does the HY. And again, you can see that -10 was set by default with that letter combination, but I'm just going to bring it a little closer together. After I make all those adjustments, I can deselect the type, and you can tell that the top one, which is the one that I've manually kerned, feels a little bit more refined in terms of letter spacing than the one on the bottom, which was automatically kerned by the computer. The next row of adjustments underneath kerning are adjustments for the vertical scale and the horizontal scale of the typography. Generally speaking, you want to keep these at 100 because you don't really want to skew your type. So if I go ahead and increase the vertical scale, you can see that it's actually stretching the type to make it taller. But if for some reason we did want taller type, this is not really the way to do it because it's going to distort the typography and create some issues. So this is generally considered bad practice in typesetting. Same with horizontal. If I do this, it's going to, of course, make the type wider, but it's also going to make it uglier because it's not applying that horizontal stretch in a way that is sensitive to the way that typography should be drawn. So it's just kind of stretching everything out, and it's not taking into account all of the necessary adjustments that need to be made when you do want to stretch out type. So again, this is generally best left at 100. There might be a few situations where you change these values, but they're more often changed by accident than they are changed on purpose. So check to make sure that you aren't skewing your type, especially if it starts to look weird. You can see if by some accident I accidentally just grab that handle and stretch it out a little bit, this is going to change to 120 because I stretched my type out horizontally. And if I wanted to undo that change that I made, I could just go ahead and type in 100 and press return to bring that back to its normal shape. Underneath that, you have the baseline shift, which allows you to set one character higher or lower than the other characters. So for instance, if I wanted to move this Y up relative to the other characters, I can select it and just dial in a little bit of positive baseline shift, which will bring it up. If I dial in negative baseline shift, it'll bring it down. Generally speaking, you want this to be at 0. Don't use it to shift the entire word up or down. So if I select this and move the baseline, of course the whole word is going to move up, but generally speaking, it's better to have that at 0 and instead just move the object up. There's also a setting for character rotation. So again, if I want to adjust the rotation of one particular character, I can do that with this setting. This is not too useful, but in a few situations you might find it handy. Underneath that, you have a button for all caps. This can be toggled on and off, and another button for small caps. Small caps should generally be avoided, especially in a font like this where I don't have real small caps built into the font. You can tell that because the T character is much heavier than the rest of the font. And so this is just Adobe emulating real small caps, and it looks kind of ugly, so it's best to avoid that. Also have superscript and subscript. So if I select one character and hit superscript, it'll move it into an exponent position. And if I use subscript, it'll move it below the words. And then lastly, there's an option for underline and strikeout, which you may find useful in certain situations. In addition to the character panel, you also have the paragraph panel, which allows you to make adjustments to the greater paragraphs rather than just individual characters. I've created an area type object to demonstrate some of those functions. And if you don't have the paragraph panel for some reason, it's usually bundled with the character panel. But if you don't have it at all, you can always go up to Window and down to Type and open it here. So at the top of the paragraph panel, you have some different alignment options, including left alignment, which is the default. Left alignment is going to create a straight edge on the left side and have a ragged edge on the right side. Right alignment is sort of the opposite of that. It's going to create a straight edge on the right side and a ragged edge on the left side. And then in between those two options, you have center alignment, which is going to align each line down the center, creating a rag on both sides. And then the last four options are for justified type, which is going to slightly alter the space between words to actually create a straight edge on both sides. And while a lot of times this seems like a great idea, it actually causes a lot of issues because those slight adjustments in letters and spacing can cause some problems with readability, and a lot of times it looks uglier and it really isn't worth the hassle. So the default of left align is usually going to be the right default, but this is up to what you're doing. Underneath the alignment options, you have some options for indenting. The one on the left is going to create a space on the left side, and the one on the right is going to create some space on the right side. There's also an option for indenting just the first line of each paragraph. So this is good if you want to add that first line indent to indicate that there's a new paragraph. There's also space before and space after, and these dial in extra margin between paragraphs. So if I dial in some space before, it's actually going to find each new paragraph and add a little bit of margin above that paragraph. If I instead use space after, it's going to look exactly the same, but the difference is in this case, it's finding the ends of paragraphs and adding spaces to the other side. So in this case, those look like the same thing, but in certain situations, they're going to act a little bit differently. But this is the best way to dial in those margins. It's much better than having these set at 0 and instead adding extra line breaks, because those line breaks are actually really limiting. And if you need to go back and adjust the spacing between paragraphs, you're not going to be able to do that easily. Whereas if I instead use this function, I can go ahead and dial in any amount that I want and be really specific and precise. And the last option here will allow you to create hyphenation. So there's certain situations where Adobe will insert hyphens into your words to help the line breaks be a little bit more even. You can usually see that if I shrink this way down, turn hyphenation on, see that this word got hyphenated. Whereas if I select this and uncheck hyphenation, it's going to force that word to remain as a whole word. In general, turning off hyphenation is probably a good idea, but it's a necessary evil, especially in areas where you're setting type on a really tight column structure. The last thing I'll show you is the glyphs panel, which can be accessed under Window and then under the Type submenu and then Glyphs. This will bring up a panel of all the hidden characters that you can't normally type with your keyboard, but are part of each font. So I'm going to go ahead and double click to put my cursor inside of this type object, and then hit Command A to select everything, and then hit Delete to delete all the text inside. And then if I double click on one of these characters, say the copyright symbol, you can see that it's going to input that directly into that type object. And that'll allow me to use all of those characters. So this is a really good thing to know about.